Band. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and the senior advisor to the American Worker Project. I think we have a very important conversation here today. As most of you all know, the economy is not working for most people, and that's especially so with the millennial generation. Research by a colleague of mine showed that millennial wages, a typical worker around 30 years old, is earning less today than a similar worker 10 years ago, and really about the same as someone almost 30 years ago in the 1980s. Yet at the same time, the cost of basic goods like healthcare, housing, higher education has gone up much, much faster, which has really put this great pressure on people, especially millennials. So, we talk about their student debt. 7 in 10 college seniors in the class of 2014 graduated with debt, an average of nearly $30,000. And as Tom Kochan explains in his new book, which, by the way, I highly recommend it, all should take a look and read, public policies and the business strategies and organizational practices of the past are failing today's workers, especially young workers. And so we have this long trend of many things sort of failing in our larger economy, really, really coming home to roost with this generation. But there are some signs of optimism, some good news a little bit here as well. Just think of some very recent campaign successes, Fight for 15 in several states and paid leave elsewhere. So we have some mixture of things. And another positive element I think that's important to think about is young people. This generation of young people is the most progressive generation on record, more supportive of progressive policy changes to raise wages and rebuild the social contract than any previous generation. Yet they're also skeptical of government and organizations, so there's an interesting challenge there. So we have deep reasons for concern, but also for optimism, which is why I'm so excited to hear Tom and our panelists talk how we rebuild a modern economy that works for the millennial generation and not just for the wealthy few. To talk about how we got here, where we are going, and where we could go. So let me briefly introduce our panelists and our moderator, and then invite Tom up here to kick off our conversation. So first we have Dr. Tom Kochan, who is the George M. Bunker Professor of Work and Employment Relations at MIT's Sloan School of Management, and the co-director of MIT Institute for Work and Employment Research, and also the author of this book again, Shaping the Future of Work. He also teaches an online class about the future of work, which is available and quite interesting. Then we have Malini Cadambi Daniel. She's the Director of Higher Education at the Service Employees International Union, where she helps organize contingent faculty across the nation, as well as she's also a commissioner for the New York City Equal Employment Practices Commission. We have Representative Mandela Barnes. He's a state representative from Wisconsin's 11th Assembly District. He's got a background in community organizing the Milwaukee community. And in Wisconsin, Representative Barnes stands up for workers and young people with his advocacy for public education, collective bargaining rights, criminal justice reform, and more. And our moderator, Maggie Thompson, she's the Executive Director of Generation Progress Action Fund. She's a Wisconsin native and the Executive Director. Formerly, she was the campaign manager of Generation Progress's Higher Ed, Not Debt campaign, which has been a highly successful multi-year effort to ensure that quality education is affordable and accessible to all without financial hardship. So with that, I'd like to welcome Tom to the stage. Thank you, Tom.
Well, thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is sort of Wisconsin Row here. I grew up in the great state of Wisconsin. At least I used to call it the great state of Wisconsin. And someday it will be again. And with Representative Barnes providing the leadership, I have more confidence that it will be again someday. But what's going on in Wisconsin is only a microcosm of what we're seeing across this country. The good and the bad. And I started off the online course asking, is this the best time or the worst time to be entering the labor force, to start a career and to build a successful family life? And I think the answer is it's a little bit of both. And so what I want to talk about here this morning is, first, why am I so concerned about these issues today? Why is it worth all of us gathering here this morning to address these issues? And then talk about what I think can be done. And then we'll get into a good discussion of these issues and maybe put a little more precision on how we might all work together. But first, why? Well, it's very clear that the Millennials could be the first generation in many years of experiencing a declining standard of living. That, the old American dream is that every generation should be able to improve and have a higher standard of living than that of their parents. Well, it's not clear that that's going to happen. Now, do I believe it has to be a doomsday scenario? Not at all. But if we don't do something, if we don't change the course of 30 years of wage stagnation, and obviously the inequality that has produced, if we don't change the direction of the quality of jobs that are being created, so that we don't have, at the worst part of the recession, over 40% of our young college graduates coming out and being underemployed or employed in part-time jobs or various kinds of activities that don't use the skills that they've acquired. And if we don't really change the course of events, then we won't change the trajectory of job dissatisfaction that we have seen in national polls, where young millennials now are the most dissatisfied with their jobs and their career opportunities. Only 25% indicate that they are satisfied with their situation at work today. That's not sustainable as a society, and that's why we see so much frustration out there in this political season from certainly experienced workers, but particularly from young workers. So that's the challenges those are the challenges that we face today. But there's also great opportunities, and what gives me optimism and enthusiasm for really addressing these issues is a little bit of what David already has said. The enormous amount of innovation that's going on at the local level, the fight for 15, innovations in our communities, innovations in our state governments with new minimum wage legislation now in California and New York, the passage of sick leave provisions across the country in cities and increasingly in states, including my home state at the moment of Massachusetts. So there's lots of activity at the local level, and there's a lot of good innovations among startup firms, among entrepreneurs who have a social vision, among young people. When you ask people what do they really want as their top priority in their jobs and their careers today, what do young people tell us? They tell us two things. One, they want to really address big problems in our society and meaningful issues that are challenging our planet and our economy and our communities. And secondly, they want a decent balance between their personal and work lives. Well, we can do those things if we take some of the innovations that are going and move them to a national level. So how do we do that? In the book and in the course, I stress 3 points, 3 things that I believe we need to do. Number one, there are a lot of very good companies. We call them high road companies for a shorthand. That is, companies that really not only are profitable and good for their shareholders, but also create good jobs, good careers, because they invest in their employees, they provide employees a voice, they listen to their employees for how to improve productivity and customer satisfaction, and they derive high levels of productivity that can then support a good compensation package and career opportunities for progression. We have companies in every industry, from airlines, the favorite example is Southwest. In food and retail, the comparison is Costco versus Walmart. Or in New England, we have this favorite little company called Market Basket that demonstrated that people will support a company that promotes good jobs and good quality and good prices for their customers. And so we can build those companies, but we don't have enough of them. They're drowned out by the Walmarts of the world. That, yes, everyday low prices, what that means is squeezing labor, keeping labor costs low, keeping unions out at any cost, successfully keeping unions out of their property, and making sure that it works well for their shareholders, but not for the people who generate the profits for the firm. So we need to have more of those high road firms. We need government policies that encourage them, and we can talk a little bit about how to do that. Second thing we have to do is we have to restore worker bargaining power. There's no way around it. If we don't give workers a voice in shaping their future and ability to regain control of their destiny, then we are not going to get the kind of change in trajectory of this economy. We're not going to get wages and productivity moving again in tandem as they did many years ago. And so how do we restore bargaining power? Well, that means rebuilding unions, and it maybe means building some new organizations. Maybe we will call them unions, but they are emerging around the country in various ways, largely led by the millennial generation. Then the third thing that we need to do is we need to get the various stakeholders in our society working together. Millennials want this. We just were talking before about the fact that young people today are sick and tired of the gridlock we see in Washington or in some state capitals and in society, and the fact that labor doesn't talk to business, business doesn't talk to labor, and government only talks to themselves in their own little cloistered subgroups or caucuses. But nothing gets done. And I believe that if we bring labor and business and education leaders and government leaders together, along with the voices of young people, we can make progress. But that requires us bringing these parties together. So quickly, how can we make it happen? Well, I'm an optimist. I think we will have, hopefully, maybe this is a hopeful statement, but I do believe that once this election is over, assuming the American public does the right thing and comes to its senses, that we will have a short window of opportunity to make progress in this town and across the country, because the voices of anger out there are going to find their way into a more positive statement for what we can do. We can start to work with the most successful companies in building good jobs and high quality. We can reform our labor laws so that they support workers in rights to organize for collective bargaining and open up new ways to work together in partnership that we know works in places like Kaiser Permanente and some parts of Harley-Davidson and other companies that have worked effectively, labor and management, to improve the quality of health care, the productivity, and the customer service that they provide. We can also go beyond and open up our labor law to the new forms of organizing that we are seeing. Workers creating apps that tell you where the good jobs are and where the bad jobs are and how to navigate moving from one job to the next. Ways of empowering, let's say, the gig economy, the Uber drivers, providing them with the same protections that everyone else in society deserves, to mobilize, to support each other, and to have a voice, whether we call them contractors or call them employees. We need to fix our employment policies so that we bring up the low road with minimum wage legislation, not just in selected states, but across the country. There's a litany of things that we can talk about. But if we have the political will, I think there may be a short window of opportunity where we can move forward together. And then finally, I do believe we've got to put all of our efforts in working in a very synchronized way. That means as we think about buying things, as consumers, as young people and as more senior people, we've got to ask, what are the labor conditions this product or this set of services was created and is being delivered? This is what the Restaurant Opportunity Center does. They ask people to not only rate the quality of the food, but also to make sure that they're asking what's the conditions under which the servers and the people in the kitchen and the people who are providing this great opportunity and recreation, what are their conditions and how are they working today? So I think if we start to work that way, we start to hold government accountable, we ask government to support high road strategies, we start to share the profits and productivity in fair ways because workers have renewed bargaining power and information that allow them to demand that they share in the progress that they are helping to create in their enterprises and in their communities, then I think we will move forward. But it's going to take leadership, and it's going to take leadership not just the president and the members of the Congress or even the members of the state legislatures. It's going to take leadership, distributed leadership, from all of us, and particularly from the young people in this country who have the most at stake, who have the strongest voices, by using all the social media and traditional media and their power at the ballot box to say, now's the time, because if we don't change now, then we are destined to see our standard of living for our children, for our grandchildren, and even for some of us more senior members of the population continue to decline in the future. That's not the legacy I want to leave to my kids and my grandchildren, and I suspect that's not the legacy that people in this room want to receive as well. So let's get on with it.
Come on in here. Give us 1 second. We'll get ourselves settled up here.
All right.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. So I'm so excited to be here because I think that, at Generation Progress, we hear from young people all the time who are really, their lived experiences tell them in so many ways that this economy is not working for them. So I think that as a generation, we've done a lot of work to build power and build a movement to make institutions and elected leaders recognize that. And sometimes that means becoming elected leaders ourselves. So I'm just very excited to take this big question. Of how the economy is not working for young people and really bring it down to discrete things that we can actually do. So can we start with the good news, the Fight for 15 campaign, which SEIU has led across the country in partnership with community organizations, because I think that is a great example of how the movement is really driving change in how we structure the economy. So, I guess just starting with you, Tom, because I know that you talked a little bit about it. Do you see Fight for 15 as a way, as a sort of opening the sort of movement for us to sort of start pushing for these broader changes? And how do you see that sort of in the context of all of the research that you're doing on the economy writ large?
Well, I think it's brilliant in two respects. First, just the term. It's got a narrative that rings true to people, and I think I don't say that frivolously. I think it's absolutely important today that we have a message and a narrative that is straightforward, that says this is what we stand for. So the Fight for 15 has caught on. People know what that means, and they can say that makes sense. Now, maybe we don't get there all at once because there may be some consequences, but we can phase it as people see it as reasonable, and we can negotiate, as they did in Seattle, with some trade-offs for business and for the community to make sure that some of the things that the business community wants make sense. So yes, I think both substantively and symbolically, this is a really critical step in the right direction. The other thing that it signals is, everyone's concerned about technology taking away the robots, taking our jobs and so on. Well, what we're going to need to do is to take the fruits of that great productivity that may be out there and that we are achieving, and we're going to have to distribute it in fair ways, and this is a step in that direction.
And Malini, being at SEIU, and Mandela, like you were there at the beginning as a community organizer. What do you think of I feel that Fight for 15 has momentum that we can really build upon, but I'd love to hear what you all think and where we go next.
Yeah, absolutely. You have more to say, I'm sure. So I'll be very brief in saying that the Fight for 15 came after my time in organizing. It happened while I was a legislator. It was during my first term, and I was invited to speak at one of the first Fight for 15 rallies in Milwaukee. And quite honestly, when they said, "Yeah, we want to raise minimum wage to $15," I said, "Wait, no, no, man. What are you thinking? Like, we can't even get to $7.65 in Wisconsin." And so, through conversations when we talked about it, it's like, okay, yeah. It took about 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I was completely on board, so I was able to kick off one of those rallies and keep the conversation going. And even people who don't necessarily agree with a $15 minimum wage, you can have a conversation about what wages should be and where we are and how historically wages have not kept pace with inflation. So regardless, it is something that's beautiful that's taken place because it's brought together so many people. It's brought together and reignited the conversation about labor and how people are valued in the workforce in America.
I completely agree, and thank you for being such a champion on this as well. But, like 3 years ago, $15 an hour was a joke. It was literally a joke where comedians were talking about the $15 hamburger and what does this mean for the country. And now it's a foregone conclusion. Like, of course, people need at least $15 to live. And this is not just in Los Angeles or New York City, but Birmingham, Iowa, South Dakota. These are all places that are solidly red that have voted, where the citizens voted to raise the minimum wage. And it's like, you're right, it's sparked a conversation. It has changed the narrative about, settling for peanuts and asking for what's more. And I'm very proud that next week on April 14th, the largest strikes ever are going to happen. So it started 3 years ago with a handful of courageous workers in New York City going out on strike. And now it's 30 countries, 300 cities that are going to go. There's workers everywhere in every industry, from every union and non-union, who will be walking out. And it's a really proud moment.
It's awesome. We're so pumped. I think that Fight for 15 is about raising the minimum wage and sort of that sort of lower end of the wage spectrum. And, we had done some research at Cap Brendan Duke, who I think is here, about how 30-year-olds today in our generation make the same in real terms as 30-year-olds in the baby boomer generation, despite the fact that the economy is 70% more productive. We're more educated. We have a lot more college degrees in our generation. Could you talk about not just the Fight for 15, but sort of if that's the jumping off point to a broader conversation about raising wages across the board, especially for young people?
Well, absolutely. This reality reflects the underemployment. We're not utilizing all of the tremendous skills and educational value that we have in our young people today. If we were to start to do that, we would create a positive reinforcing cycle of not only improving people's wages and ability to start families and have the kind of standard of living they're looking for, but it would also feed the economy. And so we need to invest. We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to invest in the social services that young people really are anxious to contribute to. We need to rebuild our communities. Milwaukee, as I go back home and I see what's happened to the great city of Milwaukee and to the neighborhoods, it's a tragedy, but it's also an opportunity that if we start to invest in our cities, in our urban areas, our infrastructure, and our young people, we'll get this economy moving, and we'll increase those real wages at a pace that is not going to be astronomical, but get them going in the right direction. That'll create a more hopeful future rather than the frustrations we see today.
A lot of times people look back at the economic collapse, and when you look in terms of money that was lost by everyday people, by people's retirement funds who just effectively just wiped out, people tend to think that the money just disappeared. The money didn't disappear. The money went somewhere. It was just all siphoned up to the top. So when you look at how money is dispersed in this country and where it's actually being kept and how people who really need it don't have access to it, that's the very unfortunate part. So who actually makes that initial investment, which is a question I go back and forth with. I don't have the answer to it, but hopefully we can get somewhere closer to an answer on this panel, which is maybe you can help me out there on that one, so I can go back home and give people a better answer.
I think what's happening to this class of workers, the millennials, is just they're being exploited. And so I think some of the things that millennials want, that a lot of us want, which is autonomy at our jobs, some flexibility, support for our life as a whole, not as parents, as citizens, generally, is being exploited. So we get this gig economy that says like, hey, you can work from home, or you can use your own car to make some money on the side, or sell your bedroom when you're not there to strangers. So I think this exploitation is masquerading what is actually happening, and this is an undercutting of social services that is happening at the same time that these jobs are becoming increasingly insecure and low wage. And there's no reason for it. We are a wealthy society. We can do better. We can accommodate what the millennials are asking for in terms of flexibility and autonomy, and have some sort of safety net and structure and responsibility by business owners.
Right, I was going to say that the exploitation happens because we're creatures of convenience. We like convenient things. We like things immediately. We don't like to wait around because we feel that we don't have to. And as technology grows and increases, things become more readily available to us. So the idea of waiting for something is extremely difficult for us, especially as millennials, where we've had everything basically at our fingertips.
Yeah. And I think, and that's such a great point, because it's not just about, I think we've started talking about wages, but your point about the gig economy, Malini, that the gig economy in some ways has a very positive connotation for millennials, but in real economic terms, when you think about benefits and all that, other than flexibility, a lot of times there are just a lot of downsides for young people who feel sort of stuck and without stability in the gig economy. So, we've got to get the wages up, but do you all have thoughts on sort of how do we push back on this idea that sort of a job without benefits or stability is, the new wave, and it's the gig economy, and it's all great? And how do we push for not just higher wages, but the stability within the workforce, but also preserving that flexibility that, to your point, Mandela, a lot of young people really want in their professional lives?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too, because somebody has to deliver these services. They're not delivered by no one. It just doesn't happen out of the blue. All the things that we get, all the things that we want, the things that we desire, somebody delivers that service to us. But the deliverers of service, we have to find a way to organize them. And the people, just like in any other labor movement throughout history, when people have just had enough. When you look at the strike that's going to happen on April 14th, fast food workers saying, no, we're done. If that were to happen, the gig economy would shut down if no one were there to carry out those gigs. So, maybe that is the next fight for 15, where, the people, the workers in the gig economy come together and say, we're not, no more Uber rides. We're done. We're going to shut DC and New York down. And that would have a significant impact.
And we're seeing a little bit of that happening.
Yeah.
Even the Uber drivers in some cities are trying to organize. We're seeing various kinds of apps come along. There's one that's called Sherpa Share, which is basically for Uber and Lyft drivers to go online and plug in how many miles they drove and what their revenue was for the end, and put in a little more information, and it kicks out what they actually were making once they adjust for all of their costs. Well, that's information, and information is a source of power. If drivers then started to mobilize, and now they've created some groups in some of the cities, including Milwaukee has an Uber drivers group. It's a very loose collection. It's really a network. They're not organized to do anything yet, but it's the first step toward mobilization. And I think that's the kind of creative forms of representation, voice, and organizing that will come from the millennial generation. And I don't know where it's going. I don't know that it's a good substitute for collective bargaining, as powerful as collective bargaining has been, but we've got to keep experimenting until we find the right modes. And I think this is encouraging. I want to see more of those kinds of apps so that we can differentiate between good employers and bad employers. And the workforce itself has the information and the power to go to where the good jobs are. And that'll hopefully force up the less effective employers.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that sort of dueling apps. It's not just for companies to innovate, it's for us community organizers to innovate. I know we have Equal Pay Day coming up on April 12th, and there are a lot of apps that use big data so that women can negotiate better and more effectively for their salaries. So
Good.
Let's see more of that. So I wanted to talk to you all about process and sort of getting this done. And the discrete fights that you think that as you look at the landscape of these economic stability fights for young people, what's winnable, where should we target, how do we disrupt this sort of economy that's not working for us? So just starting with DC, it's a little broken right now, as I'm sure you all know. So in terms of sort of breaking the gridlock in Washington and moving these policies forward, do you see any opportunities on the national level? And if not, sort of where do you think we go from there? Is it state, local, sort of where should we be focusing our energy?
Well, I think we have to keep the local innovation going, because that's where our national policies came from in the 1930s and since then. Unemployment insurance was first in the state of Wisconsin. Minimum wage was first in Massachusetts, well before we got the New Deal. So our innovations kind of move up from below. But I think there's some opportunities here in Washington. Certainly the paid family leave of some sort, whether it's just reforming the existing law or a sick leave provision, building on what has worked in the states and what the evidence shows works for people who need time off as well as for employers. That's one area where I think there's tremendous potential. I think there's another potential area which is not as well known, and that is as new industries come along. We're investing now in new manufacturing industries. Well, let's make sure we empower the workforce of the future to have the kind of flexibility to move across different firms. Let's make sure that we have portable benefits so that if we're not going to get security from an individual firm, then we got to take the next step, not only with the Affordable Care Act, but also with pensions and Social. We already have that with Social Security, but we need to supplement that with much more effective portable pensions, and I would say sick leave. If young people today are working part-time for Uber and part-time at McDonald's and maybe part-time for some social service agency.
And I have an Etsy shop on the side where they
That's
sell
right.
knit goods.
That's right. All right, if that adds up to how many hours, then proportionately they should get credits. And then if they are sick or if they have a sick child, they should be able to use that and the costs are shared. If we're not going to provide employment security within the firm, then society has to absorb some of these costs, and probably employees will contribute to some of the funding these as well. But this isn't rocket science. This is political will. So I think there's some areas like that. And then the toughest nut to crack will be labor law. But I'm convinced that we can get there if we bring creative ideas to labor law reform, not just reform, but transforming our labor law to meet the modern economy and the modern workforce.
Mandela, you're in a state house, which is obviously Wisconsin's a ruckus right now.
We're a challenged state.
He's going
Yes.
to change that.
Yes,
That's the plan.
Do you see a path forward? But also, is there sort of a lot of the policies, or if there are any that Tom didn't mention? Do you think that at the state level there are some things that we should be really focusing in on to start moving in the right direction? Sort of what's the fight for 15 of benefits?
Well, absolutely. I mean, regardless of whether it's paid family leave at the state level as well. I mean, you can raise the minimum wage at the state level. I mean, you see local governments take steps to move minimum wage ordinances in cities. In Milwaukee County, we have a living wage ordinance for Milwaukee County employees, and that's a start. That's something where a lot of places can start to have more conservative leadership at the state level. However, the biggest thing we talked about before this is state preemption, which is one of the bigger fights that we're seeing across the country. Is where cities or municipalities, counties are moving in a direction for a more fair economy. You see certain states clamp down on those local units of government and say, well, not in my state. And you see this total erosion of local control, which is sort of scary when you think about it. And the majority of the governors that have cracked down on local control and sought to erode local control are the same governors who cry foul at the federal government for overreaching. So it's very ironic, it's very hypocritical, but it happens. There's the business community has a very tight stronghold, and I personally work very closely with the business community. I try my best to involve a number of young professional organizations that are primarily business focused, because you have to be in the room and have those conversations. Because sometimes they just don't understand it at all, because nobody's ever talked to them about the importance of organized labor. Nobody's ever talked to them about what sort of standards should be in place for their workforce. Got a lot of friends who run small businesses. Got a couple friends who've inherited some larger businesses and some very profitable businesses. And we have some really frank conversations sometimes because they don't always understand. And if no one is there to have those conversations with them, the conversations won't take place, and they'll just totally ignore the issues. So, for people in the audience, the younger people, please do get involved in these groups if you can, because your voice is needed at that table. So, while I try my best in the State House to make a difference, I understand where my governor's coming from. I understand where the majority in our House is coming from. I understand where the majority in the Senate is coming from. So I have to look to other avenues to express and display some sort of influence to make a difference.
Absolutely. And Malini, we've talked a lot about legislative vehicles for change, whether that's at the state level or national level, but in terms of the way organized labor is thinking about this and approaching this, especially for young people, could you just talk a little bit about what you think unions can do, but also what young people can do to push their employers to do better?
Sure, absolutely. At SEIU, we have a lot of millennial chapters in our locals, and so they they bring an orientation to the union, to the rest of us, that there are issues that are particular to them as young people and as workers, and they marry, and that we need to be cognizant of that. So they're pushing us on things like, just because we maybe have a good job, we're still homeless, or we have student debt issues. And so trying to push on these various ways to sort of figure out what the total solutions are, because it's not enough to have a good job if you have $100,000 worth of student debt. Like what is the life that you're building here? And so I think they're pushing us at all different levels. Like we're working, again, locally, we're working at the state houses. And I just want to say, I think, even we tend to look at this as like this party versus that party, and the other party is not always very progressive on these issues. But even within the Democratic Party, we've had folks like Rahm Emanuel and Andrew Cuomo who weren't necessarily advocating for raising the minimum wage as much as they have done in their localities, and they've done it. In 3 years, they've moved so far. And I think like the movement, people engaged, people organized can actually do that. To me, one of the models in our recent memories is the marriage equality movement. So, you had that where it's like you had Prop 8, you had all of these things where it just felt like, okay, this movement is cooked. But people were really mobilized. They kept pushing at all different levels, so that now we're just like, okay, yeah, that's good. We've moved so far in such a relatively short period of time that I'm convinced that if we just keep the pressure on, that we're going to keep making progress.
Yeah, I agree. That's absolutely. I think that, Tom, one of the things you talked about was how benefits aren't following work. It's partially the gig economy, partially the sort of the way that the business community has gone. And if you could just talk a little bit, and Malini as well, about how that's not something that's limited to sort of just low-wage workers. That's something that is across the spectrum, including for highly educated workers. I think a lot of times people, when they think about individuals that are struggling economically in our generation, they're thinking about people sort of who are not necessarily as educated. But we know, because of the work that we do, that that's not necessarily the case. This covers the spectrum of education.
Absolutely, and all you have to do is look at who is listed within the long-term unemployed today. Well, the biggest group that's long-term unemployed are people over the age of 45, many of whom had engineering jobs or information technology jobs or designer jobs or good manufacturing jobs. But once they were laid off, companies decided, gee, we can hire all of those people back as consultants when we need them, if we need them, or whatever they want to call them, as contract workers. Or you now see so many people who are being hired even into healthcare. A big healthcare company that I've worked with over the years has over 45,000 people who are temporary employees. That's an enormous number. And they have a whole series of people who manage that, just to make sure that they're managing the vendors effectively. Well, these are professional jobs. These could have been, and still can be, good paying jobs that provide benefits and pension credits and building up over time, but they don't. And so we've got to either create the pension opportunities and the sick leave opportunities for people in these temporary, contracted out, and gig-based economies, segments of the economy, as well as to really create more incentives for firms to hire regular workers. I think over time, we're going to see a rebalancing of this. As the baby boom generation finally starts to retire, there is going to be, if the economy continues to grow and if we don't fall back into a mess, then I think there's going to be more shortages felt within companies, and they're going to say, gee, I wish I really would have regular employees again. Well, we can't wait for that day, so we've got to build these new institutions in between that give workers the security and the supports and the bargaining power they need now. And then if they want to go back, firms might find it a little bit more difficult to get them back, and then we'd have a reinforcing process that would help improve conditions.
Yeah, and Malini, I know SEIU, you see this, you mentioned student debt, and you all have an incredibly successful campaign called Adjunct Action. And I think adjunct professors really illustrate this in a terrible but very powerful way. This idea that we are in a contract worker economy, and people are struggling with student debt. It's something that previous generations didn't have to be as concerned about.
Yeah, so I have the good fortune of working on this great campaign, and so I meet faculty from around the country, and they're millennials, they're Gen X, Y, baby boomers. They span the age groups, but these are folks with master's degrees, multiple PhDs, who are now locked in an employment situation where it is completely predicated on job insecurity. So every semester they must reapply for their jobs. There's a presumption of unemployment. Many of them are making maybe $3-4 grand per course. So we're looking at folks who might have $200,000 of student debt, and they might be making $25,000 a year. So I've heard these terrible stories of folks who just given up on having children because they can't afford it. This young woman in Los Angeles, Fatima, she just finished her PhD. She's now teaching as an adjunct in Los Angeles, and she lives back with her parents, with her sister, in the same bedroom that she grew up in. So these are not outliers. These are folks that I'm meeting constantly. And so I think what the campaign shows and what these folks show is that even with a good education, even if you play by the rules and do everything right, if the system doesn't support you, if there's nothing that is attacking debt, if there's nothing that is holding these employers accountable, these are not sharing economy employers. These are major universities and university systems. They have the capacity to pay livable wages and give some sort of semblance of job security to these folks, and certainly benefits, yet they choose not to. If we're not able to help these folks get out of this situation, then we really need to rethink the system and have some much more aggressive
And the number
policies.
of contractors at universities now, you mentioned this in engineering, but the number it's a huge proportion at your given university that are now contract employees.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the paths for millennials who, I know when I talk about these issues, sometimes it is overwhelming to think of how we what are the paths to actually influence this. And I think, Mandela, you are just a great example of this, because when I met you years ago, you were a rock star community organizer in Milwaukee, like working with the community, and now you're an elected representative representing your city and our generation. And I think if you could just talk a little bit about the interplay between community organizing and sort of legislation and running for elected office, and sort of in your view, what are the most powerful paths for millennials that want to influence the system to take, and sort of what's a good first step?
Yeah, so I'll say going from community organizer to elected representative, not too much changes. And I say that because I'm more of an organizer plus now, because I have 2 jobs. I just get paid for one now. And I thought that running for office, I would be a little less frustrated than I was as a community organizer with progress. Now in the state that I'm in, I'm even more frustrated. But however, there's a chance to still be at that table. The microphone is just a little bit louder that I speak from now as a legislator than a community organizer. And I thoroughly enjoyed being an organizer. It was a great opportunity for me to meet the people I needed to meet. It's a great opportunity for me to learn the issues and engage communities. And now I take that same work, those same relationships that I had as an organizer, and I use them as a legislator, because we aren't seeing the progress that we want to see in the state of Wisconsin. That means I have to go back home and tell people the importance of being engaged, tell people the importance of voting and why this issue matters, and this small issue that you may not have paid attention to, how this affects you. And the important part when you talk about millennial power is we all know that 18 to 35-year-olds just don't show up to vote. And regardless of race, regardless of income, I got some friends who don't make a lot of money. I got some friends who make a whole lot of money who don't vote. And so that has to change. That is our first step. When you look at our representation in the workforce in the next 9 years, we'll be about 75% of the workforce, only 45% of the total U.S. income. So with that said, the people, the powers that be, the big money, they see a generation that's not engaged, and that's how we're able to be exploited, because we don't show up where we can most easily show up. The easiest thing we can do is vote. This takes no level of community organizing for us to just go out and cast a ballot. However, when we do become more organized, because we have the numbers, we are larger than the baby boom, about 31 million people. We're here. we're just off doing our own. We're on our phones most of the time. And that's where a lot of disconnect happens, because those personal relationships don't take place like they used to. They happen, over the internet. It happens over Wi-Fi, over LTE. But when the economy is as bad as it is for us right now, because unfortunately it is, and there's no reason it should be, because we are the innovators. We are the people who are, driving all the change we see in this country. And businesses make decisions upon what we do, the things that we like, the things that we enjoy. When you look at how they design hotels, how they're designing streets and roads, because we've embraced newer forms of technology, renewable energy. We don't mind biking to work. Things like that's cool to us. So as they shape the world around us, we have to step in and actually start making some of those decisions ourselves and saying, well, this is how we want our nation to look. But what that takes is, getting our hands dirty. And people call us an entitled generation, and they aren't too far off in saying that. We don't always like to get our hands dirty, but it is very dirty outside. We're gonna have to get our hands dirty one way or another if we want to see any sort of difference, any sort of change. So to become engaged in your communities, to work with people that you may not have worked with before, that is the only way we will truly find our power.
Absolutely, and I think just to pull out something you said, one thing that we struggle a lot with at Generation Progress is the national narrative around millennials, who we are, what our lived reality is. And to read some of the national coverage, you'd think that we all have great jobs with hoverboards and MacBooks, and that things are good, or that student debt isn't really that much of an issue, because how many members of Congress and senators went to school when school was almost free, and just keep saying, oh, just work a job over the summer, like you can pay for college, not realizing how much has shifted since they were in school. So I think in terms of how do we push back on that national narrative and really reframe the way that people think of millennials and millennial work in a way that's helpful and will help us win these fights.
And that's another thing too, is that we like to lump ourselves as just one category of people, which we are as millennials given our generation. However, we are so much different. We come from different communities, different backgrounds. We got a significant immigrant population. We have, just so many differences. So there's not a one millennial, and that's what makes us great, because there isn't one just image of a millennial that you could point to. I mean, the MacBook and Facebook, right? Those are certain things that we all subscribe to, things that we all enjoy or use typically, but we do have to remind ourselves that there are so many differences that we have to be cognizant of in order to fully and totally engage us.
Most diverse generation in American history. And Molly, I know that you work a lot, because SEIU works with a very broad spectrum of millennials that have very different economic realities that they are facing every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have, like I said, we have homeless millennials. We have folks who are dreamers. We have folks who are very active in Black Lives Matter. So they come from the different communities, and they're very active on it. So they don't speak with one voice. They may share different interests. They may share similar interests at the workplace, but they really do have a wide variety of things that they care about, and they're willing to fight on. I just think that needs to get out there, because it's not as if that narrative of the whiny, entitled millennial is coming from the millennials themselves. We read about Farmer Bro, and he's just one bad guy. There is a whole generation here. There's millions of folks doing all sorts of things and working very hard with very strong work ethics. It's just a different world that they live in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's for the rest of us to sort of change around it.
Yeah. I agree. Well, one quick round, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. But we've talked about a lot of policy solutions. But to your point, Mandela, if we want to motivate young people to get out, vote, and think about their economic stability when they're doing it, what is the one policy or hook that you think, of all the things we've talked about, will most motivate young people? Or what do you think is the first step?
Free hoverboards. No.
Free hoverboards.
Free hoverboards. There we go. I might even try that at my own peril, I suspect. I think it's very clear. Millennials are speaking to flexibility at work. It's not that they don't want to work, but they want some control over when they work. And we got all the scheduling software that can do good things or bad things in scheduling. We got all the technology that can allow us to work whenever we want, or to really focus on being away from work and working together in creative ways. I think that issue to say we want control over our work lives so we can have a good family and personal life, we can contribute to our communities wherever we live, and work really hard. Give us that control, give us the time off, give us the control over the use of technology, and that, I think, is the one issue that will attract young people, and it's entirely doable.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, economic certainty, which goes right along with that, because we are putting off those life decisions, the buying the house, the getting married, the having the children, the three big things that, you know, the generations before us were a little bit quicker to jump into. You know, if I was born 20 years ago, I'd be getting asked all the time, why am I not married yet? But the fact is, you know, regardless of, you know, the position I'm in, there's still a level of economic uncertainty that exists, and I understand that, you know, while you know, just not, that's something that I'm not ready for at this point, and a lot of people in this room aren't also, just because of the economic outlook, the economic forecast doesn't look good. So that is something, you know, it's not that people don't want to, you know, we want to live that life, but the economy doesn't present or create an atmosphere that makes us able to go ahead and just take that dive.
Right.
And we've seen it, and we've seen the worst parts of it also. You know, in 2008, 2009, we've seen it collapse. We've seen, you know, everything that so many people, you know, worked so hard for. We've seen it all just come crumbling down. So there is, you know, there's a lot of hesitation also, because we don't want that to happen to us.
Absolutely.
I think what we could do immediately is something around student debt. So whether that's like meaningful refinance options, repayment options, making it easier for folks to do any of these programs. Absolving debt is not a bad thing to think about, especially if you've gone to a shoddy college that didn't give you a worthwhile degree or fooled you into thinking you were going to be doing something that you actually can't because of the lack of education they provided. I think we really need to put these things out on the table and start voting on them, because this is affecting, you know, millions of people in this country, not just millennials, but increasingly. I mean, this is an entire generation saddled by crushing student debt and cannot make important life decisions based on getting an education. That's all they did, was want to get an education, and I think we need to have some serious movement on that very quickly.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're going to open it up for questions now. I don't know if folks have questions for the panel about any of the wide-ranging topics we covered.
Hi, my name is Sheridan, and I'm currently a senior at the University of South Carolina. I've spent the last 4 years there, and the minimum wage there is $7.25. And so one of the fears that I've heard from the $15 minimum wage is, hey, I've gone and I've gotten a degree and I've finally doubled my salary based on the minimum wage that we had, like the minimum hourly wage that we had before. So I finally made it to that $15 an hour. What happens when the person who's working in a fast food restaurant gets the same salary that I do with this new $15 minimum wage law? How do you negotiate and say, I went to get a degree, I have $40,000 of debt, and I'm now getting paid the same? How do you negotiate from that middle point?
Yeah, and I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I put that in my notes. And, you know, so many people who graduate college with a degree who are, you know, burdened with student loan debt are going to be making $15 an hour effectively, depending on where they are, once they graduate, especially in the nonprofit world. And so that makes it a little more difficult for a lot of millennials to actually buy into the $15 movement, which creates that hesitation. But when I talked about the important things that conversation has brought out, it's the fact that everybody's wages should actually be higher. So that is where you negotiate from the bottom up, where you say, yeah, well, I just graduated college. Why am I chasing 50? I should be making way more money than this. You know, and it goes back to the question, where did the money actually go? So that's it takes a lot longer to explain that to somebody, but then it's a ripple effect, because it creates more conversations about economic inequality. Well, not even that, because, you know, as $15 minimum wage come in, it doesn't just happen overnight. It's a gradual process. And with that said, it should drive other people to negotiate, higher wages for the jobs that they apply for, the jobs that they get post-college or post-graduate degree, in fact.
Yeah, the history, Sheridan, the minimum wage increases is that they do ratchet up those above them. Now, it doesn't go all the way up to the top, but the evidence is very clear that those 1 or 2 notches above the minimum will see their wages rise as well. But that doesn't happen automatically. We got wage norms in the United States that wages should move with cost of living and productivity through collective bargaining in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and so on. We're not going to go back necessarily to that, but we have to have the information that you can say, I am worth more because comparable people doing this work over here are earning $20 an hour or $25 an hour, and I'm only getting 15, 17, 18. You've got to have that information, and then you have to mobilize to make sure that you get those norms to spread to your job and to your peers. So ratcheting up the minimum wage will put some pressure on employers, but it's up to all of us then to create the institutions that take advantage of that pressure by knowing what the fair wage is, and then having the kind of adjustment of wage norms to say there has to be a reasonable differential between jobs so there's an incentive for people to get the education and to move up.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up collective bargaining too, because one employee showing up in the boardroom isn't going to make a change for everybody. That brings out the necessity for our generation to understand collective bargaining and to start that conversation back up, because the millennial identification with the labor movement isn't there like it should be. Very few people learned about the labor movement. Very few people understand how we even got to where we are in the first place with a minimum wage, with a weekend, because there are things we take for granted, and this is the point where we start that conversation back up to get us back to a place of income equality.
Yeah, Jeff Wheeler, and I work in international labor affairs, and I'm also a shop steward with AFGE. Just picking up on this point, we pushed really hard to increase the minimum wage in Bangladesh, and that happened. But what happened is the companies didn't pay any more. They flattened the wage rates. They brought down the wage rates. So the minimum wage went up, but then the total amount they were paying did not go up. And part of the problem was being able to have organized voice. And so my question relates to the millennials, which is, they're very good at communicating, sharing information, identifying, analyzing problems, but having this kind of coherent, consistent, organized voice to increase wages and benefits, it's really, really hard. And so we see these isolated examples, but it's really hard to build momentum. So I'm wondering, how do we better incubate collective, organized voice and action that is sustainable? So clearly they need to mobilize, we need to mobilize, but any ideas or any indications of how we incubate that?
Only I feel like this is SEIU's charge.
Well, I mean, the Fight for 15 movement is really, the last part always gets dropped off because I don't think it's pithy enough, but fight for $15 and a union. And so I think that's really important, because I think, you can have a movement, but without organization at the end of the day, and the institution can change, as Tom has said before, it can take various forms. But if without that sort of structure there, then who's to say it doesn't dissipate, or it doesn't, you sort of lose the value. And I think the Occupy movement was tremendous. It's changed the consciousness of the world. It's given us a language about how to talk about income inequality. And I think everybody who participated in Occupy, you can't unlearn that stuff, and they're out there doing things in their respective organizations. However, if that was more structured in an organization, who's to say that you couldn't have affected things that might have had, I would say, more staying power in certain areas? And it's not a criticism of the Occupy movement. It's just this is the power, I think, of institutions and organizations.
We have some over here, blue shirt.
Hello, my name is Parag. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown. My question is for Representative Barnes. You talked about increasing millennial turnout at elections. I'd just like to take your question, your thing a bit further and talk about millennial voting patterns in non-presidential elections? Because we've seen a pattern where millennials vote in presidential elections, but then come midterm elections or gubernatorial elections that don't line up with presidential elections, suddenly it drops. So my question for you is, how would you talk about increasing millennial voting in non-presidential elections?
So thank you for that. Even in presidential years, it's not good, our turnout. So, I mean, it's relatively better than in midterm elections. But the fact is, there aren't a lot of midterm candidates that that resonate with us, that identify with us, that speak to us. And that's the unfortunate part. Even in presidential years, I mean, a U.S. Senator from Vermont somehow has gotten a lot of younger people engaged. But overall, when you look at it, when you look at these gubernatorial elections, these congressional races, who's talking about our issues? And you know what? And when I say that we do need to increase turnout, candidates also need to increase their conversations that apply to us. And until that happens, there won't be a high millennial turnout. It takes both. It takes two to tango. We got to have candidates who express an interest in us, because why would we vote for someone who doesn't seem to have our best interests? But at the same time, we need to express that interest so the candidates know that we are watching, that we are paying attention, that their political fate is actually in our hands, especially when you look at our numbers.
There should be an Emily's list for millennials.
Yeah, right. A millennial.
We've got one here and one here.
Hi, Jen Ortega. I work on labor issues specifically for higher education and in the public sector. But as all of you have basically said, millennials love flexibility and autonomy. Speaking as a millennial who works from home, I love flexibility. But I'm just kind of curious what you all think about the Department of Labor's overtime regulations and its potential effect on flexibility for not just millennials, but the entire workforce pretty much.
Well, the overtime regulations are long overdue, to overuse a term here, but it's very clear they haven't changed from $22,000 threshold, and we have to raise that. That will require employers to be creative in how they meet those obligations, and I expect that this will increase flexibility because they will allow people to use their time more effectively. That'll be one of the productivity adjustments that they will have to make in order to absorb a change in rules and an increase in costs. It also will help some workers below those thresholds to take on more of that kind of work. And so I think their incomes will grow. I do think that I certainly don't speak for the Department of Labor and for the new rules, but I think they can be enforced in reasonably flexible ways that still set an appropriate threshold, if it's the 52,000 or whatever number they come to, or staged in whatever way they choose to do it. But it can be done in flexible ways to encourage employers to spread work around and to allow people to control their time and not to constrain it too much to the old 8 hours, 40 hours a week model, because that model is no longer a reality for many people. But we got to allow people to spread that work and that time over a longer period of time and in different places of work.
One here, blue shirt.
Hi, thanks a lot. My name is Joel Yutkin. I run a consultancy called High Road Strategies, and I should point out I come out of labor myself. I'm clearly not a millennial. I barely make it into the baby boomer, but I do have a millennial son, and I have plenty of friends who have millennial children, all struggling. What I'm hearing today, and this is a very important discussion and I'm glad it's going on, and thanks to Tom for writing your book, because I think it's stimulating. We need to begin to have the discussion, especially those of us in the baby boom. I don't think we've paid enough attention to realize how things have changed, and frankly, it feels our economy's moving in a dystopian direction, and which makes me feel bad because it means that we didn't do a very good job as baby boomers in trying to move things in a more positive direction. And but I'm trying to get a sense of, if we talk about the future of work, from the point of view of the millennials, it seems to me, are we talking about that there aren't enough, the opportunities aren't there for growth and the kind of jobs we want? I mean, is a gig economy or producing apps, I mean, what are the nature of jobs and what are the really opportunities? Or do we have to think about a different trajectory, which, Tom, you referred to investing in infrastructure and communities and so on. But all that requires, so this is much more than just minimum wage and fighting for kind of keeping, maybe getting a little bit bigger piece of a shrinking pie, but in fact beginning to have massive public investment in order to generate, which would then generate opportunities and the need for jobs across the board, and with a lot more skills of all kinds. And that, in the end, yeah, that would be, I think, we need to do, but I'm just not seeing it, and I'm not sure whether the millennials see that they need to be more engaged in that kind of movement and that kind of mobilization.
Well, it's clear that we need that kind of public investment, but I think there's also pent-up private funds and investment. You know, we have seen, for all the talk about entrepreneurship, we've seen less entrepreneurship and fewer jobs coming from startup firms in the last decade than we have in previous years. We got to reignite that part of the economy that is an important source of new jobs, and we can make them high-quality jobs if we do it the right way. So yes, we need to have more public investment in the things that I mentioned, but we also need to get the entrepreneurship spirit in place and support the young entrepreneurs who really do want to tackle educational needs, the needs of the planet, renewable energies, healthcare. These are areas where there's enormous interest and there's enormous talent and there's potential to deliver healthcare in the communities with community navigators and new ways of keeping people healthy. So all of that's out there for us. We just have to put our energy behind it. That is going to require some public investment. It's going to require a lot of investment at the state and local and community levels because that's where the services are delivered. But it also says let's encourage entrepreneurs, for-profit or nonprofit, to get on with this and give them the kind of license to create new jobs.
Can I also say that I think that, you know, there's a lot of focus on the sort of new economy work, but there's also like a lot of old economy work that is just taking advantage of the sharing, quote unquote, sharing economy, which is really the bullshit economy. It's like, so on colleges we're organizing faculty, it's like these are brick and mortar institutions, some of them with astronomical endowments that they have a ton of revenue that they're getting in through tuition, research grants, et cetera, and they've put it into a certain cadre of folks within the university and not towards instructional faculty. We've seen this with the legal profession, with journalism. I mean, these are jobs where it's like the corporations are making a ton of money, but they've decided to downgrade these jobs, make them impermanent and low wage without any oversight. And I think in your book, Tom, like you talk about this, it's like our government has not kept up with any of this stuff, and there just needs to be, there's colossal wage theft happening in every industry in this country, whether these are new economy jobs or old economy jobs, and we just need to find better ways to actually address that.
Yeah, and I think just one of the phrases you use, this idea of fighting over a shrinking piece, or a piece of a shrinking pie, I think that because of things like the Occupy movement and because of what happened with the Wall Street collapse, like millennials, we really don't see it that way. Like to your point, Mandela, like the money went somewhere, and like we know it did, it just all went up. You know, so I think we, millennials collectively, we really sort of reject this idea of austerity. You know, our economy is 70% more productive than it was 30 years ago. Like, there's money, we just got to restructure things to like get it back where it belongs. I think we have time for one more question. This is the last one. Move back here.
Hi, I'm Sam Nitz with actually with Emily's List, and also a proud Wisconsin native from Janesville. Right. So we're talking about millennials as kind of a block, but we know that it's a 16-year-old generation, what are both the like desired differences and preferences within kind of like these three waves that I think a lot of the demographers are talking about with millennials, and what are the different hurdles that each kind of essentially 5-year wave is facing in the workplace?
Well, let me say something that may not be very popular, but I'm not sure millennials are all that different than previous generations. You're just facing a very different set of circumstances. So in the online course, as I said, I ask people what's their top priority for their aspiration for their job and careers. It's 3 things. Want to really have a good work and family balance. I want to attack big problems, and I want a good financial situation. Now, we might put different weights on those, and clearly as people move through their life course and family situations, those 3 are going to change a little bit. The family issues become more salient, the financial issues become more salient. Hopefully we don't lose our drive to have an impact on big problems, but those are still the things that people care about, and the things that are going to motivate them to do something about it at their workplace. So I agree that we have allowed our workplaces to disassociate themselves, our employers, from dealing with the issues that the workforce is facing because they can get the contract workers, or they think they can get it in other ways. But that's going to come home to roost. And it's coming home to roost first in the frustration we're hearing out there from young people and from more mature workers as well in this political season. And I believe this is the kind of canary in the coal mine. This is going to start to require firms to start taking responsibility again, and require government leaders at all levels to take responsibility for addressing these issues, especially if you keep the pressure on and you come back to them with positive ideas. That's the whole idea of the course, that's the whole idea of the book, that's the whole idea of these kinds of conversations and these talented leaders here, that if you start to lay out a positive vision and not only express anger, but express a view of here's what we can do and what we are prepared to do and what we expect you to do, then we'll create a new social contract that does work. But I think I think we can repeat the same struggles that my parents and maybe even my grandparents in the 1930s experienced, but they came up with solutions that fit their economy and their situation. And now I think we've got to do the same, and I think we're seeing the seeds of it come from the kind of innovations at the local level.
Any thoughts? Yes.
I mean, I could quickly speak to the group of millennials that graduated college or started college between 2007 and 2010. We are the most skeptical of that bunch because it's right when the economy went down and right before it came back. So we are distrusting of the government. We're distrusting of businesses. We don't trust anybody. We're in this one alone. It is just us. And if we could just group ourselves, it's that 4 to 5 year span together to engage more in developing that social contract. It would be huge because we have been hurt the most, and I think we have the most to offer in terms of introspect into what an economy should look like.
Man, fall right in there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. This was a really great conversation. I feel like
you,
we have a
Maggie.
big to-do list.
Hey, this is fun.
This is great.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work. Yeah.